subscribe to them. And if you find them helpful, share them with your friends and family. We also started several years ago sending out daily inspirational messages that we hope will inspire all of you. And thousands of people receive these every single day. We write them and they go into your email inbox at 7 a.m. Eastern time every day. And if you haven't received them, go to our website. In fact, go to it right now. Go to the Louhs.com/subscribe. And all you have to do is simply put in your email address, and every day at 7 a.m. you'll receive one of our daily words of encouragement. And especially on tonight's topic, I do want to invite all of you to call in. You've got a comment or you have a question regarding your marriage or a relationship that you're in, and you just want some guidance on it. We'll try to do our best to kind of give you some words of encouragement using the traditions of the Orthodox Church and what the teachings of Christ are in that we find in our scriptures, to share and to just really to impart onto all of you. So if you'd like to call in, you can do so at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask, A-S-K, @ancientfaith.com. Just simply send us an email and we'll try our best to get to it during the show. In fact, we've already gotten several questions in leading up to tonight's show, so we'll try to get to all of those. But today is part 2 of our series on strengthening our marriage. The very first part, last Tuesday, was a show that we dedicated all to how we strengthen the marriage in the sense of how do we grow in love? How do we grow in Christ? That in order for us to show love to our spouse, we have to first be connected to Christ. Like we oftentimes talk about this, the vertical always shapes the horizontal. Our relationship with God definitely impacts our relationship with our spouse. And then we kind of continue on with that, ways that we can continue to do good for them, that we recognize that the most successful marriages are unpredictable marriages. Those are marriages that we go and do things that are unique, that are, as the old adage goes, love is in the details. It's just doing the small things that make the biggest difference. But today we want to shift to an area that so many families, including our own, at times in our marriage have found ourselves struggling with. And that is, how do we deal with conflict? We're dedicating this show to really dealing with conflict in marriage. So what is conflict and why does it happen so prevalently in our own relationships? Well, the reality is, friends, is that there are a number of reasons why we all have conflict. And I know, Roxanne, you and I have spent some time actually categorizing these areas as to why we have conflict. And some of the areas, these are just some. We can go, a lot of areas, but some of them, first and foremost, is poor communication. And I think, Roxanne, you talk a lot about this as well, about the importance of just how unhealthy communication can be in a relationship. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, I think so often, Nick, we're not always communicating. I mean, there's a lot of things that we feel. I mean, I like to, talk about human beings and, with the analogy of being an onion, and most of the time we kind of share our outermost layer, which is why when people say, how are you doing? We say, fine. But are we really fine? Not so much. A lot of the time, there's so many layers and depth of experience that I don't know that we share with our spouse. We don't let our inner world, we don't make it available to the people who love us most. And so a lot of times in that space, we're dealing with burden. We're dealing with concerns. We're dealing with, hidden aggravations. We're dealing with problems that haven't been solved. We're dealing with something I felt last week about something you did that I hadn't yet dealt with. And listen, we carry around all of this and it affects sort of the feeling or the foundation, that I have toward you, my sentiment toward my spouse. And so, that bleeds into everything that we do, but there is, yes, so much that we are not communicating on a regular basis with our partners.
Right. And, I remember we do quite often do retreats, marriage retreats. In fact, we're going to be in Sacramento later on this weekend doing a marriage retreat there. But, one of the things that we hear about through the teachings of Christ is that, if you look at 3 of the 6 things that we hear about in Scripture that Christ dislikes the most, oftentimes it's all about our words. It's about the power of words. And I oftentimes tell people to remember what St. Theophan the Recluse says. He says, remember that when you speak, you are giving birth to words, which once born will never die. They will either speak for you or against you. And then St. Basil the Great says it this way, the most common and multifaceted sin is the one enacted by the tongue. So one of the areas that we want to share with you is that one of the reasons why we have conflict is that, quite simply, we just have poor communication skills. Our words sometimes can destroy a marriage. Another area that we see a lot of struggle in our own experience in doing retreats and just talking with couples, both in confession as well as in Roxanne's practice, is in unmet needs. Gosh, Roxanne, I think this is something that we hear so much about. People are expecting their spouse to act in a way, only to figure out that when they don't act that way, it acts and really creates an additional conflict within the relationship.
I mean, sure, and this is one of the big areas that we sometimes do put words on in terms of our internal world, but we do so with a whole lot of fault finding. We do so with a whole lot of blame, judgment, or criticism. So you are responsible for what I end up feeling, and here's why. Here's what you've done, or here's what you haven't done, and we tend to really make other people responsible for the things that we carry around in terms of our expectations that may or may not have been communicated, right. Or even if they have been communicated, may or may not be in our spouse's skill set for providing for us. So sometimes we have unrealistic expectations as well. And we're not really looking at people's sort of inherent wiring in terms of what they're able to offer us in that space.
I love that. And I think, I remember in the book of James, which is just really a powerful book, as we oftentimes talk about and use a great deal in conversations with couples on marriage. And this is what James says in James chapter 4, verses 1. He says, what causes fights? What causes fights and quarrels around you? This is like this rhetorical question that he's asking. Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something, but you didn't get it. I think it's just so true that you wanted something to happen, it didn't happen. And don't get me wrong, we're not minimizing what we're wanting. It's just simply saying that it's an area that creates conflict in marriages. So one is poor communication. The other area we would say is unmet needs. Here's number 3. I would say that one of the areas that we struggle with a great deal with conflict is we despise our differences. And, we oftentimes talk about this, but, once what we idolized in our spouse, I hear this all the time, things that we loved about our spouse, oftentimes it's what we end up demonizing or disliking later. I think it's one of those things where I've heard people say, Father Nick, when they're dating their spouse and they're going through this courtship, they'll say, Father Nick, I love that he loves to have a great time. He loves to enjoy himself. I love how he watches football and just has an excitement. And then, like 5 years later, we're dealing with a couple that's saying, where she's saying again, oh my gosh, Father, he spends so much time watching football. He's never got time for us. What we once idolized, we now demonize.
I mean, and I think this is, where, there's no great manual for learning how to adapt to each other's, differences, and so a lot of times, we're really relying on an inner voice that has a foundation of and a desire to heal, a desire for unity, a desire to bring about a we-ness to our situation instead of a separateness, right? And so, we have to kind of get back to, why did God design my spouse the way God designed my spouse? And why might he have given that spouse to me? And so we sort of, have to kind of come at our differences with a level of humility that says, potentially there's a synergy here. Potentially this is going to be used as a sanctifying process within me, or sort of giving me something I lack. And so it really takes a level of appreciation and gratitude and willingness to sort of be intentional in seeing that, as opposed to sort of chastising, our differences. And I think sometimes even in our differences or in our expectations, sometimes we forget that we ourselves, play a role in what we get upset about too. I sometimes think, okay, I'm mad at mad at the way my spouse is different, but why was I not mad at the way my spouse was different from me last week? He's been different all along. Why is it suddenly bothering me more now? And so sometimes we have to see that, there might be things that are bothering us deep down that have nothing to do with this moment between my spouse and I. And when we're a bit more sensitive to that, and we have a little bit more interoceptive awareness where we know what's happening within ourselves, it's easier not to let that sort of come in and be divisive when it comes to something like our differences, right? And so there's a level at which we have to sort of evaluate our upsets, evaluate our spouse, see their goodness, but also see where we are in humility.
A lot of what we're sharing with you tonight are things that are found in our book, Renewing You, a priest and psychologist, and a plan that actually Ancient Faith published. We actually have an entire chapter on strengthening our marriages, and part of that chapter is all about dealing with conflict. So definitely, if you haven't purchased that book, I do encourage you to do so because I think it might be very helpful. There's some really cool activities that we encourage you to share with your spouse at the very end of that chapter. That I think would be very helpful. And we also, as we mentioned at the top of the show, we'd love to hear from you. You have a question, a comment, feel free to call us. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346, or email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. So if number 3 was despising differences, then number 4 we would share with you is all about negative self-talk, really faulty thinking. And, we talk about this a lot. We talk about thoughts and the power of our thoughts, but how powerful our thoughts are in a relationship. Because sometimes the way we see our spouse, the way we think about what their intention is, what we think about their motive is, why they acted that way, we kind of create a narrative in our own mind about what they were doing. And that thoughts, those beliefs, shape our behaviors towards them. And so an area that causes so much conflict that we see is all around negative self-talk, what we have told ourselves about our spouse.
And chances are, when we're not tuned into that, if we've been playing and replaying, a hurtful, judgmental, negative, thought process about someone over and over in our mind, we set ourselves up to respond poorly when even minor things happen, and then we sort of point our finger at the wrong problem based on the story we've been really telling ourselves. And I think sometimes, we really forget to humanize our spouse, right? It's just so easy to chastise somebody that we live with every day. It becomes very easy to see, their most obvious weaknesses, right? And sometimes we forget that we're on the same team.
Exactly.
And that if we're not on the same team, it's going to be very hard to maneuver through life if we can't find that common ground.
And Roxanne, I think this leads us to the 5th area. And again, these are just some of the areas that we just came up with. There are probably other areas that we're not able to, just with time purposes. But I think one of the things that we have to also acknowledge is just our sinful nature. All of us have our areas of struggle that we struggle with personally. And what we don't realize, we oftentimes think sin is just between our relationship with us and God. But sin is contagious. In other words, it impacts everything around us. It impacts our relationship with ourselves, it impacts our relationship with Christ, it impacts our relationship with the people that God has put in our life, and it impacts our purpose in this world. And so we can never minimize just our own personal struggles, whatever they may be. And all of us have at least one area. I would say that we all have many, many areas. But as the Bible calls it, the persistent sin, the struggle that we face, how that impacts us and how that bleeds into other parts of our life.
I would say, most of us in general tend to overdo negativity and judgment and underdo love, mercy, and grace. And this is inherent to just being human. And so, yes, those persistent sins and knowing, what is it within me that maybe sets me up to respond with less patience, I think it's important because if we're likely to overdo negativity and judgment and we don't know when we're most, prone to doing that, we don't know that we are doing that, and we don't spend time in sort of self-reflection and studying ourselves, we really miss the opportunities to interrupt those cycles and change direction. And that's really so important and foundational in marriage, is that we sort of not try to be perfect, not really put these unrealistic expectations on ourselves, but that we kind of see what's happening and we can kind of take a different position, and change the fork in the road. We go in a different direction with our marriage when we change the direction we're going in individually.
So these are just like the 5 areas that we just think about that are things that create conflict. And you could probably add your own to this list. But one of the things that we want to do in this first part is how do we defuse the problems? How do we diffuse anger? How do we diffuse conflict? Nothing happens without our intent, with our actions behind it. So it's one thing to say, well, I just want to do this, or I want us just to stop fighting, as you'll hear some people say in marriage counseling, but it doesn't happen just simply by saying it. You have to put some promise to it. You have to put some action behind it. And so I love what one of the church fathers says. He says, theology, St. Maximus the Confessor actually says this. He says, theology without practice is the theology that the demons love. In other words, they love it when you just simply talk about it, but never put it in action. And obviously the book of James says faith without works is dead. So what are some decisions that we can make today that are decisions that can help us? Because we know that conflict is going to happen. We're not all the same. We think differently. We have differences, and that's the beauty of the world. I mean, God didn't intend to have all of us to be the same exact people. He didn't put us all in the same potter's wheel. We all have our own gifts, our own talents, just like the disciples. They all had different areas. So what are some promises, declarations that we can make today? Well, here's number one. And again, these are things that Roxanne and I thought of. You may think of other things, but these are things that we just think might be helpful. And that is that I would say number one is that let us promise to always act and not react. So often in relationships, we're always responding to the problem as opposed to having a plan prior to dealing with the problem. So we oftentimes, in the midst of that conflict that we're in, the emotions are already so high. And this is not just between couples, really in every facet of our life, even with children, even at work, that so often that once we're in that emotional kind of hurricane, it's very difficult to see clearly. It's very difficult to speak with love, speak with compassion, act in accordance to what Christ would want us to do. And so for this reason, we want to encourage you to have a plan that helps you to deal with that. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is a pre-fight plan. In other words, we're going to have conflict, but how do we deal with that? And so here are some things that we just wrote down. You can add your own list to it, but you need to have some things that you're just always that are going to be core principles or values that you have as a family. Number one is never put it off. The Bible says what is down in the well always comes to the surface. So never putting it off means, okay, let's be purposeful about taking time to truly listen. So sometimes we can go not only a couple of hours of not talking, sometimes you'll see conflict that takes place several days. And the longer you pull it off, what we're seeing more and more is that if there's not a opportunity or a vision of when to come back, it actually creates resentment. And so I would say number one is don't put it off. Allow some time, a break, if you will, but allow yourself to also have a clear vision as to when you're going to come back to discuss those issues. There's also never name calling. This has become so, as we were mentioning earlier, really poor communication. When we call our spouse names, and so it's so easy to do that, especially in our frustration or in our anger. Most times, people may not remember what the actual conflict was about, but they will remember how you made them feel, what you said about them. You may not be able to remember, for example, the last 10 sermons that your priest has given you. But if I asked you to give me 10 things that someone said negatively about you, or 10 words that people said over you in your life, it wouldn't take you time to figure those out. You could easily kind of think of those things. So remember, never name calling. Never raise your voice. This is an area that I think so many people, especially, if we grew up in a house where there was yelling or was a kind of boisterous or passionate, if you will, conversation or communication and conflict. Sometimes we feel like if we raise our voice that we can kind of get much more accomplished. But what we're finding out more and more is that harsh words actually stir up more anger. Harsh words even stir up more anger the louder we get. Never keep records. And what I mean by that is oftentimes in couples, you'll remember things much more and keep records more than Christ does. In other words, I was with a couple several years ago who was telling me as if I was the judge or the referee in this, as they were both in my office, about something that had taken place in their marriage 12 years ago, that the spouse had on a number of times had already asked for forgiveness, had repented from it, had spoken to his spiritual father about, but it continued to get brought up more and more. So there was never any opportunity to build off of that or to grow from that because it was constantly being put in front of them. I also would encourage you to never use the D word, which is the divorce word, Roxanne. We talk about that a lot when we do marriage retreats, that sometimes it's becoming so easy just to say, we need to get a divorce. We need to get a divorce. And never in front of our children. And what I mean by that is that some communication and conflict, to be quite honest with you, could be healthy in front of our children. But I'm talking about communication that's negative, that's toxic towards one another. That should not take place around your children. When you're not able to communicate, when your voices are screaming and yelling at one another, when you're yelling about how you want to get a divorce, those things absolutely cannot take place. They got to be what we call non-negotiables, things that just do not take place in a relationship, in a marriage.
And I love what you're sharing, about sort of having this plan, because what does that really do is it sort of builds an emotional climate that's safe. If I can trust you, I can be close to you. And trust builds emotional intimacy. And we have so many questions that come in about intimacy. How do we build intimacy? Well, intimacy is built by trust. And we build trust by creating a culture in our home that says, I can be open and honest with you, and I'm not going to get burned when I do it. And you can be open and honest with me, and I'm not going to burn you. We can't hide from lasting feelings. They have a way of sort of catching up to us in relationship, and they affect the connection. And so if relationships don't have a trusting environment that where people are willing to open up, to work through feelings and share them in ways, that build connection, and they're not revealing the vulnerable side of their anger, but they're revealing only the controlling side, there is no trust. Okay. So there can be, therefore, no intimacy. So this is really, really important. And if your relationship today does not have this container, we really encourage you to build one. Sit down with your spiritual father, sit down with a Christian counselor, or take notes during the session at the very least, to sort of say, hey, none of these things. If these things happen, we take a break to rebuild and come back and reset so we can sort of change directions. Because again, if we can't work through our difficulties, the onion layer just gets thicker and thicker and thicker until there's so much built up between you and I that there's a disconnection. And so really to do all of this, to sort of follow all of these rules, we really can never express feelings in the midst of feeling them. So I really caution you, if you're somebody who feels convicted, your blood pressure's high, you're feeling very, fired up about something, that's really the worst time to talk about it. It takes time for us to figure out exactly what our anger means. It's not always the surface expression or the surface story. Like we said, there could be so many things going on in our own lives or in the background of our lives. And so that's really never the time to express it. It takes time to figure out what we feel, but it takes no time to shatter the person that's standing in front of us, to completely devour our relationship. And so expressing things while we feel them, hoping that it goes well, is like sort of walking into a fire to salvage something and expecting not to burn in the process. And so we really have to sort of begin to talk about our feelings after we've separated from them, enough to sort of understand them. And what is our goal in communicating them? If all I have is negative words about your character, I'm not ready to communicate.
Right.
If all I have is blame about what you've done, I'm not ready to communicate. If all I have is describing the intention of who you are and what you intended, I'm not ready to communicate, because I'm not allowed to say those things about you. All I can do is talk from my own perspective in terms of my feelings, my needs, my experiences, and what this event meant to me, and how I really hope for it to be different.
You're listening to Live with the Louhs. We're so grateful that you're joining us tonight. We are talking about part 2 of the series, Strengthening Our Marriages, and we're dealing specifically with conflict. What are the causes? And not only what are the causes, how do we cope with conflict? Because we know it's going to happen. And so the very first part was that us identifying what are some of the areas that we conflict so much about. And then the second area we started to spend some time on are what are some practical steps, promises, declarations that all of us can make today. And that first one was how we can promise to act and not react, having a plan in place. We'd love to hear from you. If you have a question, comment, feel free to call us at 1-855-237-2346, 1-855-237-2346. Or you can email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. Roxanne, we just got this email question, and I wanted to read it to you. It says, I'm an Orthodox Christian, and one of my friends recommended me to listen to this radio show. I recently started listening and find it very helpful. I'm in the process, though, of a divorce. My husband and I were married for 13 and a half years. We have 2 children, and my husband's very upset with me, and he wants the divorce. He considers that he was not respected, that nothing made him happy during our marriage, that I humiliated him with my short temper, and he decided that he had enough. We had a busy, agitated life, and I was always alone due to his busy schedule and working weekends. He was cold and did not pay much attention to our needs or show affection towards me over the years. I find myself in emotional pain as I'm not ready to give up on my family. I didn't realize that my marriage was so frail, and I ignored his signs and his warnings. I'm still hoping we could reconcile this marriage now that I had a wake-up call that I'm trying to become a better wife for him. I would like to ask you, what are the steps that I should take towards reconciliation, and how should I behave around him right now? And also, how can I start working on myself, accept this separation, and create a plan B in case the reconciliation is not possible?
I'm so sorry to hear, just the pain of that circumstance. It sounds ongoing and really difficult. And, the first thing when somebody finally opens up, we just listen. And we try to find and experience some level of ownership for what they are feeling as a result of our role in it. And so it might be that I kind of walk back through, now that you've shared everything you're sharing, I can see how you would have arrived at feeling so distant or in pain because of my, inability to know how to communicate, that this was maybe a weakness, right? In most marriages, by the way, walk in without a tool set. So it's not surprising when we don't know how to work through our hurt in ways that are gentle, and that we don't know how to talk about things in ways that are healing. Sometimes we just close up and we don't talk, and other times we overreact, if we weren't given those tools. And so trying to find some level of ownership and listening in a way that says, tell me your story, like tell me your experience of these last 18 years. I want to know, my heart is open, I'm ready to hear, and I'm ready to heal. And whatever it is and however long it takes, I'm willing to walk with you, and I'm willing to relearn, things that I don't know. And I'm willing for us to learn together. I'm willing to learn on my own. And to be able to validate that I get it. Your feelings are valid. I think that's sometimes something we struggle to say when somebody is hurt. We struggle with ownership. We struggle with validation, and we struggle to listen, because sometimes the hurt that somebody is describing, creates a very visceral defense within us that says, I couldn't possibly be wrong here. And, something I'll tell you in being able to validate somebody is, listen, we don't have to agree with every single perspective that somebody is sharing in order to validate their experience. We just have to say, based on what you're saying, I can understand how you would arrive at feeling that way. And I hear you. Hearing your experience changes the way I see how you might feel. Like, we don't know the experience until someone describes it in depth. And so being able to sort of say, I validate you, does not necessarily mean that I agree with your every perception. But we are working to understand who they are because of what they're sharing. And then ask, finally, the fourth step would be really asking, what is it that you need most from me that I was unable to give in this marriage? And believe me, whether this marriage is saved or not, I always recommend people, even who are ready to walk through a divorce, to learn from each other what needed to be better, because chances are we'll do it again. We will repeat similar struggles, new lawn, different problems. The grass is not always greener. We tend to sort of take our issues into future relationships. So it's worth walking through in some sessions with your spiritual father, with a counselor, to learn and heal from what went wrong and how to make it right. And sometimes there's saving in that. Hearing each other's more vulnerable side can breed healing. And don't stop praying, because again, I always find that sort of God has this just amazing power to soften hearts where we've been unable to reach them. And so I would never stop praying through this journey to answer this writer's question, and to work on the healing, and to really just listen, own, validate, and try to experience what would be healing for him.
Right. And, and that's going to take some time, obviously, because that there's going to be a lot of that trained, those neural pathways that have been in our brain that have kind of created this, in his mind, what you're doing and why you're doing it. And this really, a lot of that, as we mentioned earlier at the top of the show, what are some reasons why we get angry? It's just negative thoughts that are going to have. So one of the things that you're going to have to be is be very patient in that. That's why it's really incumbent upon us to get either your parish priest or a therapist, a Christian therapist, to really kind of help navigate that. Because it's like taking a broken, if you had a broken arm, you wouldn't just simply, pray to get better. I mean, you would obviously do that, but you would also be getting the people that are really trained in that way. And for that many years in a marriage, that much invested, I would try your best to try to get them to realize that for no other reason. And I love Roxanne says this a lot when we do, marriage retreats. She'll say to couples that may bring up that topic at the retreat is that she'll say, at the end of the day, you have to be able to stand before Christ knowing that you did absolutely everything you could to save that marriage, that every tool that was available, you should be able to stand before him and say that you did. And a lot of times people struggle with that because they've done some things. They just haven't done everything. And if a marriage is it's a sacrament, let us, and Christ, as we mentioned yet last week on our show, that he created marriage. His first miracle was at a wedding, and all the disciples believed in him because of that miracle at that wedding. Then we should do all that we can to try to save them and get the help that we need to do just that. Roxanne, here's another question that came through the email just now. It's a question that kind of is the opposite of what you were sharing earlier. It reads, my husband approached me and told me some things he wasn't happy about in our marriage. He said, she said, I felt I was being ambushed after the 20 years I devoted to him and our children. I felt as if he was being selfish and told him so. I also told him that I felt obligated a handful of times in our marriage when we would go away to simply just to be with him and to do things for him. But since that day, he does not take time to be with her. He barely touches her. He struggles. She says, I struggled for years with this feeling of being undesirable to him. And I still struggle, as she says, and I've decided to take the high road and be the best wife I can be under these circumstances. He really just quit on us, and I don't know what to do about that. I have worked on myself through therapy with several priests. They have offered to work with him, but he is not interested. Could you please address, what do you do when someone is unwilling to try?
Work to keep your voice a godly one. It is so easy. This is where temptation is very real, that we, sort of start assigning a very negative script to this person. We lose sight of when we get this angry and this hurt by someone, we start to lose our connection with Christ, right? And as we lose our connection with Christ, we start to lose our connection with the person standing in front of us. We become less motivated by the peace that only God can bring when we connect to his Spirit. And these are the moments where we really have to pray for our spouse and pray for ourselves to navigate these issues with skill, with compassion, and with the help of the Holy Spirit. In these moments, our only responsibility when our spouse is sort of in a difficult, sort of contained and removed and distant, cold place, we are there to contain the fire, not fuel the fire. And so this is not the time to kind of go down the play-by-play of what happened or to reignite the fight. This is a moment of prayer and really working to keep our voice a godly one that is seeking to heal, seeking solutions, seeking to support. It's very tempting to want to just get angry. It's very tempting to also want to give the cold shoulder and sort of shut down in response to a spouse who's shut down. But when we do that, we're fueling the problem. So this is the moment where we remain kind, and we remain really the best versions of ourselves, who I would want to be. And we borrow our relationship with Christ when we can't see Christ in the person standing in front of us. When we start ignoring people, it really, in relationships, when we ignore somebody that we love, we really do cause a reaction in the brain that's similar to that of physical pain, because we weren't meant to ignore each other in that way. So,
can you say that again, Roxanne? I think it's very helpful for our listeners to hear that.
Yeah. That when we shut down from someone that we love, we are causing a reaction in their brain that is the exact same process of that of physical pain. And so, and this is where I look up and I just say, wow, God, like your design is beautiful. we were not meant to ignore or shut down from each other in cold and a distant existence. And which is why, what you said earlier, Nick, was so important. Like, we never want to go too long without repairing things. And I get it, if you felt ambushed because, he's been sort of saving up a lot of things, that kind of breaks the rule of one thing at a time. We're not supposed to sort of ambush our partner with 75 things that have gone wrong. And if we haven't had good tools for talking, that may be where we're at now. But, we need to sit down with someone who can kind of help us look at more thematically, what has been wrong, because chances are those things could kind of be grouped into maybe 3 or 4 things that then feel reasonable that we can begin to problem solve or adapt to the things that don't have easy answers.
We're listening to Live with the Louhs. We're so grateful that you're sharing with us these questions, these email questions. And if you have a call that you'd like to call or on us, you can call us on our show at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or email us a question, as these previous emailers did, by emailing us at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. So we have a voice, a message that was there that came in. Yes, and a speak pipe question. We'd love to hear that. So Matushka Trude, if you would, our producer, if you can play that, we'd appreciate it. Oh, okay. All right. So she just shared with us that that person no longer left it on there. So if the first area that we talked about, one of the ways that declarations that we can make of choosing every day to act and not react, then I would say number 2 is to choose humility over pride. Now, we hear this a lot. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of your spouse more. So it's not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of your spouse more. And so real quick, I just want to kind of share with you some areas that you can do this to show that humility. And that's one is think of the word love and the letters that make up that word, L-O-V-E. So L is love, listen to them. 70% of conversations, they've done studies on this, actually aren't even heard. When people are listening to that conversation, the first 30% of it, they're only thinking of a response to come back to in that conversation. So be purposeful in just simply listening. And when you listen, make sure that not only are you listening, I remember our daughter saying this, Roxanne, early on in our, when Gabrielle was saying to us, Mom, listen to me with your eyes. And I thought
wasn't that so? I mean, that was so. It's so true.
So when someone is sharing with us, I think we could talk about this. It's just making sure that you are attentive. I love in our divine liturgy we say, wisdom, be attentive. In other words, let's listen to this. This is important to hear. And so I would encourage you to make sure that you're listening attentively to what they're sharing. Remember that most times people are only thinking or listening just to answer back. So listen attentively.
Yeah, and I would say one thing to add to that is never assume you really understand somebody's perspective in something. It's always interesting to me when I ask people to explain themselves and I ask someone else to just listen. I'm always a little bit surprised by a perspective or a meaning that somebody was interpreting from an experience. So, even in the most, fundamental sense of the word, when you think about listening, really listen. Like, who are you because of what you're sharing? How are you taking this? I can't assume that I know, and I can't assume that you took it the way I meant it, or that you took it in any way that I could even fathom. And so people will teach you who they are if you just listen to their perspectives.
I love that. O is ownership. Ownership or understanding. Understanding begins when judgment is withheld. So when you truly make an effort to say and ask non-threatening questions. I love to and sometimes it becomes kind of cheesy in our home, but, I'll just say in my own way, Roxanne, am I understanding you correctly? That's the kind of questions that we need to ask each other. Am I understanding what you are sharing correctly? Because as Roxanne was just mentioning, oftentimes what we think, and this is where that negative faulty thinking comes in, we kind of have a perception as to what that person is saying. And you even hear them say at times, that's not what I am saying. It's because we've kind of fed that faulty thinking that we've created in our mind. That's why that question is so important, Roxanne, is that as us asking each other, am I understanding you correctly? And then allowing that person to go back to that L of listening to what they're actually sharing with us.
Yeah, and I think, that's where the ownership piece comes in. And again, you're not blaming yourself for why they feel it. You're just trying to try, like, I can try to see that. I can see that now that you're explaining it. That's sort of what it is. It's like, I can see it now that you've explained it. And I know that everyone can do this, because if I listen to two sides of every couple from the history of time in doing marriage counseling, I can always see why somebody feels what they feel on two sides of the same process. In every situation. There's never a time where I go, I really can't see that. So if we listen enough, we can see why someone has arrived at what they feel. Okay. And so we're just making room. We don't have to say, this is not about right or wrong. We are not establishing
Very good point.
right or wrong, superior, inferior position that one. No, we're not looking for positions. We're looking for understanding of who our partner is because of something that has gone wrong to upset them.
And then that V, if we're doing this LOVE, that we listen, we ownership, we validate. So once that person, your spouse, has shared with you what is concerning them, what is bothering them, repeat then what you've heard. So you validate it. So I understand that what you heard was, I understand that this is how you got to this point. You're validating what they're saying. And I'll be honest with you, in so many arguments that I've just heard in having with counseling and marriage classes, this is an area that so many people struggle with, because once they are able to, even when they move past that O of ownership, sometimes they struggle with just trying to validate that, because their ego gets in the way and they start thinking, well, that's not what I meant to do. And again, as Roxanne beautifully stated, this is not the point where we're asking for sides and who's right and who's wrong. It's simply making sure that at the end of the day, you know exactly what it is from their own words.
And one thing I will say is that if your spouse is having a hard time with ownership and validation, be careful that you're not speaking in a way that's making them feel attacked, and you're not defining their intent. Because when I watch couples, when I see them stop being able to listen, stop being able to validate, stop being able to understand, it's because the other spouse has begun defining their intention and telling them who they are and why they did something, and they're attacking their character because of it. So again, these are moments of self-reflection. If you see your partner is not doing all of these things on the listening side, you have to ask yourself, am I attacking their character? Am I defining who they are because of what they did? Or am I just talking about my own experience, my own feelings, and my own needs?
I love that. So that's such good information, Roxanne. And then finally, the E is empathize. One of the hallmarks of being a Christian is that when we can step out of our own shoes that we're in and walk into what other people are experiencing, and our spouse being the number one, understanding what they're going through and empathizing that way. Doesn't mean that you're going to agree with everything that what they're saying, but you're allowing yourself to walk in their shoes to experience that. The Bible says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the will of Christ in you. That's found in the book of Galatians. It's this idea that I'm going to walk into their shoes. So again, I just encourage you to make sure that you are LOVEing. You're listening, your ownership, you're owning it, you're validating it, and then you're also empathizing. You're empathizing. So again, this is just simply saying, I'm going to choose humility over pride.
So in being this sort of other side of the person speaking, remember, we're not going after the you, we're talking about the I, right? So we want to get rid of the you're so edgy, I can't even talk to you. We want it to be, I'm concerned about you. Is everything okay? What's going on lately that has you, out of sorts or so upset? I perceive that you're upset. Am I right? We really do. The old adage, going into a problem asking questions, is a really good idea rather than telling people, who they are. Or you never help out with things around the house. Remember, we're coming back to I'm really feeling overworked or overwhelmed and I'm really needing your support. Can you do X, Y, and Z? for me, or stop spending so much. You're an overspender. Hey, I'm really feeling pressure and concern around our finances. Can we sit down and look at the budget together? So you notice one is sort of defining, attacking, telling someone who they are. The other is sort of saying, this is my experience here, and I want to share it with you. I'm not blaming you. I'm actually not blaming you. I'm sort of bringing to light something that's bothering me, and what it means to me, by the way.
I love that.
And so we really want to be careful, again, that we are creating a culture of safety. The idea of sort of these acronyms, that Nick is going over the love and sort of, the I statements, not the you statements, and doing it with grace, gently, respectfully, accepting, and empathetically. This is the culture of safety that breeds the intimacy and trust that we need. And, again, if there is anxiety around conflict, it means we are not going to be open and honest with each other in conflict, which means we can't repair conflict, which means we have disconnection and distance. Okay. And that's the type that leads to the divorce when the kids go away to college, because we haven't talked about anything for 15 years. Right.
Yeah. I love what we're sharing. I hope and pray that, Roxanne, that what we're sharing, if just one couple hears what we're sharing and it helps them, I know that it would mean so much to us to know that it's making a difference. Here's a question that came through our YouTube channel regarding the show. It says this: my husband and I often disagree about his parents. My mother-in-law constantly wants to be around and overly involved. It causes a lot of arguments. It's better, but I still hold anger. Any advice?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the moment where we have to decide, okay, who are we as a couple and what do we need? When you start to define your own family system outside the greater peripheral family system, you figure out what you need as a unit. Without that, we really stumble. If we are relying on old boundaries of our families of origins, we really struggle to decide what we need between us. And so this is a moment of not defining the mother-in-law, but defining who I am and what I need as a wife and mother in our own family. And so it's not about blaming, mother-in-law for infiltrating, but talking about more or less what I need. And so, this is sort of the important piece. And then I would say, when you think about relating to your wife's parents or your husband's parents, you have to think about the why. We're relating to them in order to honor our spouse, so there's this level of honor we assign to that person, not because of your own personal connection to that person, but because of your personal connection to your spouse. And that's a really important, boundary that you sort of have to differentiate in your heart. So it's not about what you feel toward mother-in-law. It's about defining what's important in our family and why does this person, this mother-in-law, matter to us? She does have a position of importance because I love and value my spouse.
I love that, Roxanne. Great advice. So number 3 would be, if we're saying number 1 is to make sure that we choose to act and not react, that number 2 would be choosing humility over pride. Number 3, I would say, is choose forgiveness over resentment. It's so, as we mentioned at the top of the show, it's so easy to hold on to unforgiveness. And what we see is that unforgiveness is the prison of the soul. Many marriages are remaining really in prison, and I would call it the devil's prison, if you will, the enemy's prison, simply because we have not moved past the areas that have caused so much hurt and so much pain. And again, as you see in our book, Renewing You, we talk about this. We're in no way saying that whatever was done was okay or that it's right or justifying it. But we also recognize that forgiveness, in large part, is more about our relationship with Christ than the person who offended me. I want to read for you just a second a quote by St. Mark the Ascetic, a really powerful statement. He says this: "Whoever prays for those who hurt him lays down the demons. But he who opposes his offender is bound to those demons." You see, it's a spiritual battle that takes place. When you hold on to that unforgiveness, you're being bound in that prison of the soul. But when you let go, when you just simply pray, God, give me the strength. Help me to get past this movement. Help me to allow myself to forgive that person who's hurt me. You are laying down that spiritual battle that's taking place on a daily basis in your life, and especially allowing the demons to win in your own life.
And again, I love this idea of spiritual warfare. We have to remember this, right? Because that is the only way we fight as a unit, the common enemy that we're both up against, that our marriage is up against. If we sort of fall for it and pin against each other, we're fighting the wrong person, and we're not strong. The Bible reminds us that when one falls, two can help each other up, and really the cord of three, which obviously includes Christ, it cannot be broken. And so, it's so important to remember the enemy that we're fighting is not always each other, but it is the division and the voice of the enemy that really seeks to destroy a connection.
He's the divider. I mean,
he's the divider,
this, yeah.
Right. Especially connection that's going to go out and do good things in the world.
I heard someone put it this way, that a happy marriage is a union of two good forgivers.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love the fact that, there's times that I know in our marriage, Roxanne, 20 years of marriage plus, that, I've done things that have offended and hurt you. And I love that you're quick to forgive. And I hope that, that's what I hope to do as well, because I know that, we're going to be different. We're going to, just like every couple, we're going to have differences in the way that we approach things, differences in the way in which we look at things. But at the end of the day, we have to recognize that there is an enemy who yearns to put our marriage, like every marriage out there, in his trophy case. And so I just want to encourage you, all of you that are listening tonight, is to remember this, that forgiveness won't change the past. The past is the past, but it can change your future. It can change the future. And that, one of the things that I love, C.S. Lewis, he writes he said once, to be a Christian, to be a good Christian, means to forgive the inexcusable in others, because God first forgave the inexcusable in us. I mean, isn't that so true?
I mean, it's so beautiful.
So I just want to encourage you that just fight hard to remain in unity with one another, because the devil is trying to divide the two of you, dividing your relationships. I think, Roxanne, you usually always say this, that, we're on the same team. We're on the same team.
Absolutely. And, just sort of finally, I do want to mention, submission, and mutual submission. The Bible specifically speaks to husbands and wives about this sort of mutual submission. And, everything in the Bible, you always talk about this too, Nick, that we really don't want to pull things out of context, and be able to use something for our own cause. But I think if sort of marriages can remember that we're sort of called into this, we're all sons and daughters of Christ. There's no positions of superiority, and we are really called toward this mutual submission. Maybe you think about Colossians 3:18, where I hear husbands quote this often, wives are to submit to their husbands, but what does it say in Colossians 3:19? It says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Right. Which of course makes it easier for wives to submit. It goes hand in hand, right? So husbands are sacrificing and they're not harsh, and they're dying for their wife. They're laying down their life. So yes, she can, fall into that because he is a trusting and safe person, right? So everything, I think, if we are failing in our marriage, if we look up and we humble ourselves before Christ and we work on that relationship, it oftentimes becomes so much easier to do this relationship because we all fall short. Every one of us, every day, ongoing from now until the day we die, we struggle, right? And so if we aren't borrowing our faith to love our spouse, it's going to be hard to do so.
Right. And, you think about, Roxanne, how just on a number of different ways, how St. John Chrysostom challenges us. I love how he says this. He says, husbands, never call her simply by her name, but with terms of endearment, with honor, with much love. Honor her, which means to elevate her, and she will not need honor from others. She will not want the glory that comes from others if she enjoys that which comes from you.
I mean, that's just so beautiful.
And he just ends with this. He says, prefer her before all, so that on every account, both for her beauty and for her discernment, and always praise her. I just think that's just so beautiful. This is coming from a saint of our church who never was married, but he speaks so beautifully about the beauty of marriage. And he says in another part that when we love our spouse and are willing to do all that it is, that union that they have rivals the holiest amongst. Isn't that beautiful? Just that constant just beauty that is provided for us. And so I just want to encourage all of you that no matter, where you are in your own walk of faith, no matter how, wherever you are, wherever your marriage is, to always remember that what we're sharing with you tonight, let it start with you. Start today just by declaring on a very intentional level that I need to make some decisions. That number one, I'm going to decide that I'm going to act and not react. Let's sit down as a couple and kind of create this plan that we're going to, because that is going to happen, that I'm going to choose humility over pride. That I'm going to make sure that I'm doing all that I can to listen, to understand, to validate, to empathize, and that ultimately I'm going to choose forgiveness over resentment. That I know that as the forgiven, because God has forgiven me, that my job is to forgive them as well. We hope that this has really been helpful in your own marriage. And I encourage you, as I did at the top of the show, the book that Roxanne and I wrote, Renewing You, A Priest, a Psychologist, and a Plan, which you can find here at Ancient Faith Publishing. Just go to store.ancientfaith.com/renewing you. Their entire chapter is almost everything we've talked about and a lot more, obviously, on marriage. And so I just encourage you, if you're struggling right now, take a look at this book. I hope that it'll be very beneficial to you. And next Tuesday, we have a very good and dear friend of ours, Dr. George Stavros, who's a psychologist, is going to be with us, and we're so looking forward to having him here with us and talking to us about psychology and in faith, and just kind of sharing with us some words of encouragement and wisdom. That'll be next Tuesday. So we thank you, and I hope that all of you can be with us next Tuesday. And thanks to Matusha Trudy, the producer of tonight's show. She produces all of the live shows here on Ancient Faith. We thank her. God bless you all, my friends, and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, A Priest, a Psychologist, and a Plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with The Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.